This is Restless. Welcome back to Restless, a post-mortem on the young, restless, and reformed. I am your host, Matt, joined by Pastor Michael. You are joining us during the rise and fall of Mars Hill month here on the show. Pastor Michael, how are you feeling to be here recording our first part of our reaction to The Aftermath?
It's exciting to be this far. It's been a long
That's
road,
right.
and it's exciting to be this close to the aftermath of our reaction to The Aftermath.
Perhaps we will call this After the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill Part 1. My wife really wanted our podcasting to go well today. She brought me a insane drink full of garlic, turmeric, and apple cider vinegar that she had me take right before. So if I'm sounding different today, it's exclusively that drink, not a new mic, nothing like that. No other big changes, but.
Well, I just drank a glass of chocolate milk, which is probably the worst thing you can drink before recording a podcast.
Probably is.
So if I start clearing my throat, I would say I'm sorry, but I chose to drink it. So I don't know if I'm actually that sorry.
He's not that sorry. So we are here to cover the final non-bonus episode of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, Aftermath. That's what it's called. Not The Aftermath. We're in the time where we're dropping articles. We're in Aftermath. And this episode of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill is very long, just like the last one was. And I do feel a bit bamboozled. I won't lie. I think in our last episode, I took a good deal of time praising how well constructed the episode was, praising how high quality the journalism was. Well, I did that and then was treated to this episode, which is not the worst episode, because the Bobby Knight episode is the worst episode of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. But this one is pretty bad. It's very long.
It's close for you, at least.
It's
close.
Because I think one thing, so we are going to cover this in two parts, because this episode has two very different components that they want to do that are woven throughout. They want to describe things that happened after Mars Hill closed, but they also want to relitigate once again some of the big controversial issues of Driscoll's teaching, of what he acted like, these big themes they've been wanting to deal with throughout. And so we are going to cover this in two parts. Today, we are going to be covering, I don't know, for some of you, it might be the more boring part, but the things they talked about as Mars Hill died and closed. And then in our next episode, we will cover and we will litigate hard the issues that drove this show and drove us to want to do this much commentary on it. I don't know if we're regretting it 12 episodes in, but we're 1 year in, we're 12 episodes in, and we're ready to go. The other thing we'll say is a month after we record this episode, so we are calling on our listeners right now, a month after this episode, we are going to record one kind of reaction show where we look at how people responded to this show, because we have had many listeners send us blogs of all kinds of people saying, hey, here's what this person said about the show. We want to hear your reactions. Was this show good, helpful, bad? What was the good, bad, and the ugly? Let us know. We are going to record an episode. We're going to use material from the audience when we do it. And so we're excited to get your opinions on the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill 1 year later. Pastor Michael, are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it. Let's dive in. I'm ready.
So let's cover what happened. And I want to say we are actually going to cover a lot of what didn't happen, of what they didn't cover. Now, everyone knows when we describe each episode, we describe the thesis of the episode. We're going to save that for the second part, because that deals more with the themes that we're driving it. But I want to say that they had, I think actually, I'm going to give them credit to some of the things I really felt like they missed along the way. I think they had some very limited options of the way they could actually cover the aftermath of Mars Hill. Because when I was listening to it, the thing that I couldn't help but feel was the biggest miss and that they don't really cover is what happens. What was it like when Driscoll announced she's quitting? What happens in the time where he's leaving and then Rick Warren is now going to preach the final sermon? They've talked to Rick Warren. What did Rick Warren think about all of that? And obviously the thing they can't cover because they can't get Driscoll to talk to them no matter what is what was the process of I'm in Seattle with this insane severance package, which we'll get to
oh man, will we get to that?
to I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona, planting the Trinity Church, right? Those are the like, and again, they covered some things with the churches that were planted and what they did with real estate, but these huge questions that are so interesting, they didn't cover. I even think they kind of yada 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 over Driscoll's media appearances over that year. And I actually think that may have been one of the most interesting things to really try and figure out where he was at and what he was thinking along the way.
Yeah. Yeah,
Now,
it's fascinating.
go ahead.
It was interesting listening to this episode again, because I was trying to think through, when all of this went down, I was out of the, YRR Driscoll phase, whenever that was, like it felt to me, for instance, like when Driscoll was going to plant another church, like he had been out of the picture forever. Like it seemed like it had been many, many years,
right?
But it had only been like a year since everything collapsed. But because I was outside of it all now, I wasn't really paying attention or tracking with it as much. It felt like much longer period of time. So I imagined actually what it's like for those people there who like watched it all go down. They feel pretty burned. And then within a year and a half or whatever, he's planting another church. That would be pretty brutal.
Yeah. I do think that is probably it, because I do think most of us, especially with how short our attention spans are and most of us losing interest in Driscoll at this point, did feel like, he's back now. He's kind of been gone. So they missed this, right? They don't even really get interviews with the people who invited Driscoll on these shows and these conferences.
I wish they would have. That's one of the things I was thinking, man, it would have been great to talk to some of those people. Why did you do that? And maybe they wouldn't talk, right? They didn't say that they wouldn't be interviewed. There are a lot of people at the end that they say wouldn't interview for this, which is notable, and we can talk about later.
I would like to bring it up now because I think it is an interesting question. So now eventually Tim Keller does give Cosper an interview, as we know, it wasn't a special episode, but he lists all kinds of people who won't talk to him. John Piper, new leader, who was now no longer again, the new leader of X-29, Matt Chandler. I mean, he lists a group of people connected to this story who won't talk to them. Why were so many people rejecting their interviews?
This is one of the interesting questions to me. Now, I feel like having now the hindsight of listening to it all, you do hear how, something like this could easily put like a really negative spin on no matter how you interview, right? Like it's got an agenda and they're going to try to push that. And so maybe, just maybe, there were some people that were like, yeah, I don't trust where this is going. Although most of this, my assumption is most of these interviews they were asked for before it actually happened. Also, just like if Christianity Today reaches out to you, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a great trust in Christianity Today. So that would be one thing. However, Mike Cosper was in a lot of these circles. I mean, he has connections to a lot of these guys. People. He did. He knows some of these people. And so the fact that they still wouldn't take an interview, to me, sounds like they're just trying to get away from this as much as possible.
Yeah.
Even though they were a big part of it, even though they helped with propping up Driscoll in various ways, it does sound to me like they're trying to distance themselves.
Man, because it would have been such a killer interview to get to ask John Piper, does John Piper have any regrets? Oh
Oh
man.
man, yeah, like that right there, like it would be really nice if some of these guys who aren't just like radical progressives now,
Yeah.
it'd be nice if some of them would come out and say, "Oh yeah, here's where we did make some mistakes."
Right.
And to his credit, in part, it does seem Tim Keller did come around and do some bit of an interview, but it would have been nice to hear from a lot more of these guys.
Yeah, I do think it's the question in the end is CT's reputation and where people thought this was going so bad that people weren't willing to do it. Are people really just trying to hide from any question of this, which is bad? And it's probably some combination. But I do think we should play a clip that we did actually get. Again, they kind of just, oh yeah, he gave a bunch of these over this year between planning a church. They did include at some length one clip when Mark Driscoll went to Robert Morris's Gateway Church Conference and said he was not going to be a speaker, but this is what the pastor there said. And again, I would have just loved to hear a little bit from this guy in 2021, but here we go.
In a room with a few thousand people to talk about a scheduling change. That change happened because Mark Driscoll had withdrawn from speaking at the conference. Morris talked about his personal relationship with Mark, and he said not to trust everything that you read on the internet.
He did make some mistakes. Here's what I figure. We've got two choices. One is we could crucify him, but since someone's already been crucified for him, the other choice is we could restore him with a spirit of gentleness, considering ourselves, lest we are also tempted. And it's very sad that in the church, we're the only army that shoots at our wounded. And I want you to stop it. I really do. Thank you. I'd like for you to show your love for him. I'd like for you to just welcome him. Mark, would you stand up? This is Mark Driscoll.
There's a level at which I get the spirit of this.
Let's stop there. I think Driscoll speaks in a second, but let's talk about, Robert Morris. Everyone really likes it. It's such good rhetoric when you get to switch the words around. We could either crucify him for this, or, I mean, man, like, he's just got a riled up crowd ready to go. Pastor Michael, what do you think about this? I mean, this is just, again, mega church. This is that mega church life, though, right?
It is. It's so weird to like have a guy be like, yeah, this pastor just blew up his church and he made some mistakes, but let's restore him. What does that even mean? Like, what does that mean? Where is your authority? But obviously, like you're saying, like that's the mega church way, right? I mean, we have the authority. We just have it. We just have it.
Get this man back into a 6-figure salary right now.
Yeah. I mean, maybe not right now because he's still got that right now.
Yeah.
But after this year, somebody's got to be giving him $500,000 a year. Otherwise, what's the poor guy gonna do?
Yeah. That's
by the way, even just hear that, I'm
gently.
Like, what would have been good? Mark just always talked about how his dad did drywall his whole life. It probably would have been really good for Mark Driscoll to have to go and just lay drywall for the next handful of years. That would have been really good for him, I think. But I wasn't in the position where I got to decide how he would be restored. So I did not have the mega church.
So the interesting thing, because I let it play slightly longer, Mike Cosper even says, I kind of get the spirit of this. Is what spirit is he? What is he? What is the kernel of truth that at all exists in what this guy just said?
I assume it's just, hey, we want to be like nice or something, right? I mean, we want to we want to make sure that everybody knows, even when they've made pretty big mistakes, that there's a way for them to be redeemed and a way to bring about some form of reconciliation. But that's not what's going on.
Right.
This is literally covering up something for a guy who's very clearly running from any responsibility, running from any repentance, who's literally skipped town when he had so much that he needed to be held accountable for.
Right.
There's no truth in like restoration for him does not look like, hey, somebody was crucified on his behalf, so we're just gonna like clap our hands and be happy for him. Like that's not how this works. That's not the process that the crucified one himself laid out for us.
Yeah. All right, let's hear what Driscoll has to say when even though he didn't want to be a speaker. Again, if he didn't really want to be a speaker and he didn't know this was coming, I do give him a slight amount of sympathy. But
I think, by the way, my hunch is he knew this was coming.
Yeah,
but
he probably
we can
did.
talk about it in a
Of course,
second.
he probably did.
And appreciate it. The church should be a place marked by grace. But one must marvel at the fact that while a church of thousands in Seattle is in a collapse spiral, the guy at the center of it, a guy who's been found responsible for years
I'm going to skip all this. I don't want
of unresolved conflict and broken relationships, somehow he gets treated as the victim in a room full of pastors and ends up invited on stage to tell his story.
Thank you, Pastor Robert. What do you want me to do? If you give a microphone to a preacher who's been gone for a while, he could go for a long time.
There's incredible power in storytelling.
Dang, I thought they've left more of that in because I've heard that.
How long had he been gone at this point? Isn't this just
Not-
like this is only a few weeks or something, isn't it?
Yeah.
Huh. No, so in a little bit, actually, after this clip, they're talking with another guy and they're talking about how this other brother gave a powerful prophetic word over Driscoll that, this is actually an opportunity for him that he's going to change from being like a young man or whatever to being in the place of a father, a brother to be in the place of a father. And if you remember, this is actually exactly how Driscoll tried to spin his previous controversies too. Right. He said he wants to be more in the place of a father figure, basically, rather than what he had been doing. And that makes me feel like, part of it is just, I have zero trust of megachurch pastors, basically of any kind. I just the moment I see it, I just don't trust it, especially when with all that flourish and all of that dramatism. And it just gives me the heebie-jeebies a little bit, and I don't trust you at all. But to have them just say, yep, we got a prophetic word from the Lord, that's the exact same thing that Driscoll has just been saying a few weeks before at Mars Hill, before he decided to, kind of tuck his tail and run. That makes me think that actually this is something that Driscoll was very involved in, that they are talking behind the scenes and that they are trying to figure out a way to help their friend. And they're trying to give him what he wants, in this situation.
And the discernment bloggers were, what they were writing about is that all of Driscoll's post Mars Hill appearances were with Pentecostals of some form.
Megachurch Pentecostal types.
Megachurch Pentecostals. And that
where there is little to no accountability,
right?
Where it's well known that guys who have serious issues, especially with power and trying to abuse power, just get away with it and get to do whatever they want and just keep going, right? And the moment that they're caught in one way, they just flip it over. And I always think of Todd Bentley. Bentley, the revivals down in Florida. I don't remember where he was. Lakeland, Florida, revival tents and all this. And he would kick people in the chest to heal them. And so the guy was an obvious fake. He's a horrible guy. And while this is all going on, he's having an affair with one of these women that's helping with the revival. And he gets divorced from his wife and then marries this woman that he's been having an affair with. And then they start a church together and a new revival together.
Right.
But that's what happens in these circles, right? So of course, these are the circles he goes to.
And for Driscoll, right? Driscoll then becomes the most mild case ever. This will be super easy.
This will be
an
easy.
inconvenience. Dude, we're not having to pretend you didn't have a marriage or that you were threatening people's lives.
Man.
This is And so I think it is. Yeah, it's just crazy. And we will someday, when we come back to Driscoll after we've left this alone for a while, we will do our own full reaction to the interview where Driscoll rejects Calvinism, because the like 30 seconds they play in the show is not the whole thing. And I think trying to dive into the psyche of that interview will be very interesting for us as guys who hope you haven't rejected Calvinism. So one of the most interesting things they mentioned about the Trinity Church, the new church Driscoll planted, quote unquote, by the way, quote, like the most huge air quotes I can possibly throw in, is that there were families that moved from Mars Hill to Scottsdale, Arizona to help this plant get off the ground.
Well, there's gotta,
Isn't
even just
that
listening
mind
again,
blowing?
the fact that Driscoll got all kinds of like, domain names and all sorts of things like that. I don't think that he was like actively involved in those things while he's at Mars Hill, right? I can't imagine that he was like spending all of his time making sure that like, he had access to all of these things and he could take them with him if he left. It just seemed to me when I heard that there's got to be a lot of people behind the scenes that were helping him that whole time. At the moment that he's getting ready to leave, like they were there helping him get out of there.
Yeah. But man, again, a group of people I would love to hear from, the people who followed him to Scottsdale, Arizona.
And have they stayed? How many have stayed? That's what I want to know too. How many of the people that followed him are still there to this day? Because by the way, apparently this place is still there.
Yeah. A fascinating thing Mike Cosper mentions that I think we actually have some expertise here in is that Scottsdale Mark is a different Mark Driscoll. Pastor Michael, we have reacted to dozens of clips for our Patreon channel, and we will continue to do so, of Scottsdale Mark's new best sermon rants.
Scottsdale Mark is actually a really great way to even just describe the difference.
So why don't you tell our listeners, the hundreds of people who are not yet Patreon supporters, what it is like to listen to Driscoll today compared to the Driscoll they know and love to hate as the villain of this podcast.
Yeah, so beforehand, you can get on the Patreon. You can do it right now. You can just go right now and sign up for it. It's only $3 a month to be able to hear us talk about Scottsdale Mark. But what we've been saying the whole time is, Scottsdale Mark is Boomer Mark Driscoll. He just, it's all very canned. It's all very planned. Every once in a while, you'll see him break out into an actual rant that's not just completely prefabricated for YouTube clips. And it's like, whoa, like there was a little like moment where we're like, oh yeah, there was something that we did like about this guy when he would go off on some of these rants. There was something intriguing about it. No wonder people were drawn to this. But it's just these little moments, and then he's back to the script, and his jokes are lame, and he is a Boomer Mark Driscoll now. And so of course he moved to Arizona. Scottsdale Mark, it just makes sense.
Right. Yeah, man, it is a shell of whatever you enjoyed or appreciated got out of the old style of Driscoll preaching. One interesting thing is we had a listener, I'm not going to use their name. I don't know how many of these details I should say, but they actually, and this was not explained, how did they get this huge building out of nowhere to immediately begin filling with hundreds of people? Right? How do you just, again, it's like there's this insane amount of, right, they go through the complicated and difficult things of breaking up Mars Hill by the way, it tells me that every multi-site church that says, yeah, we're all going to become churches one day is like, can't possibly be true because of how the financial structures essentially have made that impossible.
Yeah.
And so they walk through the difficulty of that, but they don't walk through this question. And again, because I'm sure no one would talk to them about the actual what it took for Driscoll to go from in a year at Mars Hill to boom, we're launching a thing with multiple services, hundreds of people, a full brand team in a year. But we had a listener reach out based on how they got this building, that the building was owned by a pastor, friends with Robert Schuller, who, this is the like make friends, influence, mega church guy. And he was friends and wanted to do a similar thing in the Phoenix area. That congregation folded. It didn't work out, but the RCA's classis held on to the building, and they've been kind of financing all the congregations in the area, for better or for worse, has been just by renting it out to various mega churches who needed a space. And when Driscoll moved to the area, they made a arrangement with him. And so while it's probably well known that the RCA as a whole, the structure, the whole denomination is struggling financially, spiritually, all kinds of problems, this specific classis, which is their word for presbytery, as I will feel free to quote this listener said, is flush with cash due to whatever Driscoll and the Trinity Church is paying them for this building. And so again, just think about that. Somehow this was someone found this place, negotiated it, rent it. Like, there's a lot that went into this,
man.
And
it was so quick after they left that it's like this was thought up right away. I mean, they had to start jumping into this right away.
Like, how do you even know, like, oh yeah, that's the right city, like location, like there's so many steps. And obviously one of the insane things we mentioned, which comes out at this point, which is one of the things that made Mars Hill and all these churches trying to spin off so difficult, paying off debts, mortgages, breaking up, was that so much of the churches, the money they had like on hand in a bank had to be paid because Driscoll was given a $650,000 severance package. Insane.
Yeah. Well, it was. Yeah. So that's his severance because that was his yearly salary.
I know.
At that time.
Yep.
So he just gets 1 year salary, which, wow. Yikes. That just seems so absurd to me to be a minister of the gospel making that much money, right? It seems just there. I don't know how to rationalize it in a way that I can try to defend somebody that's making that much money from the ministry. Because
maybe it's, and if it is, you can tell me if this is inappropriate to say, but like the entire, as we've mentioned, I'm involved in a church plant here with salaries for people. The entire church plant budget for the next years is lower than this one, 1 year.
Many years. Yeah, right.
And so, it is crazy because it's notable that Presbyterians often are not, they're not actually afraid of trying to pay pastors well and things, that they're like, when that's possible, they happily do so. But yeah, I don't think that there is any way that you can say that the gospel is being preached for anything but financial gain, which Paul said is something that will happen. And he noted, but I just don't know how at that level that can't be what is basically happening.
It's just it's such a ridiculous sum and what a, mess when you have someone that just implodes everything and now you have to pay him for a year.
Right. I want to play one clip about the son of one of the pastors, Driscoll or whoever, pretty unceremoniously fired, and how this kid went down to the Trinity Church and tried to confront him. Because I thought this was one of the few times where we're actually trying to cover something or someone actually trying to speak to Driscoll after the collapse.
There was no guile. Eventually, Mark made his way out there too, to say hello to the people who'd waited to meet him.
And then he saw me and we were shaking hands and he was like, "Oh, that Benjamin." I don't know if he said that exactly, but that was like the idea. He recognized who I was, and I just told him, "Hey, I came down to see your church. Yeah, I told him I was there for the anniversary, and I never realized this, but yeah, I don't know how tall Mark is, but I was definitely looking down at him. But I was just looking in his eyes, and I just was like, hey, like, there were a lot of things that happened in the past that weren't entirely, but I would say we're largely we're largely influenced by you, and I would just really appreciate if you gave my dad a phone call and just told him you're sorry for a few things that happened. Like very, very non-confrontational, but yeah, he got extremely nervous, and I don't think he really knew what to do. Like, he was kind of in shock, and he kept talking with me, and he was like, well, your dad, there were some things, and just like now looking back at it, like, I'm not surprised at all, but at the time I was just like, are you serious? Like, come on, man.
It wasn't long before Mark was ushered away, and Benjamin headed out too, accompanied by a security guard.
When I was leaving, there was a guy who came out with me, and it was the same guy who came in me, and I was just like, do you have any family involved here? Like, and he was like, yeah, and I was like, well, you might want to think twice about that.
So here's one of the reasons I wanted to include that, other than, sick burn on that short pastor guy.
That's yep. I was thinking the same thing. Like, what a power move.
Obviously, again, we have talked so much about so many ridiculous megachurch things, right? That your pastoral greeting line, right? You've got your security guards and, all that. But here's my thought. What if everyone who knew Mark Driscoll from Mars Hill just started showing up here for the greeting line to say, would you call my dad? Or can we talk? Would you give me a call? Every week forever.
Yeah, just start it right now. Hey, 5 people a week. Start heading down. Maybe Christianity Today could fund it with the untold amount of money they've made from this podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what would that do? It'd be really interesting. And it would be a really interesting way to try to go about this, right? Because they talk in here about wanting some kind of, reconciliation. They want some kind of change. A lot of the people involved in this podcast, one of the reasons that they agreed to do it is because they're hoping, in a sense, that something will come out of it. So yeah, I think that would actually be an interesting way to go about it.
Yeah, I really think so, because the comparison they kind of give towards the end of the episode of this idea of like what repentance could look like is, once again, we have not treated him this way, but he's largely kind of been treated this way in the podcast. Sutton Turner is the example of repentance, which I really hope is true, right? We've been pretty critical of him, but I do really hope they describe him basically for a year kind of going around and trying to meet with everyone he can to try and reconcile relationships. And so obviously that move alone, obviously puts him in a different category of Driscoll.
Definitely.
So I think I should be clear. I think when we're criticizing it, we're criticizing how the story is handled, not necessarily what he did afterwards, right? Because it's of course, I hope, and entirely possible he did the right thing, right, with these people along the way. But I think you have a really powerful chance to try and differentiate him and Driscoll. And where I want the differentiation to happen is, how did they respond to all of this?
Yeah.
But the problem is, what we get along the way is we kind of soft sell Sutton Turner's involvement in everything. Like, I'm coming in, I'm trying to fix the, dude, it's pretty clear you were kind of the axe man, based on anything. And so what really, and even as an important thing as we're going to come to here as we talk about the other thing they choose to chase in this episode, all the really pain we have to acknowledge is, dude, then what we need to do is we need to truly paint what he was doing and what he was like. And from there, let the repentance happen. Not be like, well, this guy's not Driscoll and he repented. No, it needs to be like, this guy as bad, Driscoll, and he repented. And that is what Driscoll needs. That is the path forward for him. Right.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So I just think that there's a there is an opportunity there. But the other thing and that again, maybe it is what is interesting to Christianity Today. Maybe it is because of the interviews they had available. Now, they do talk about some of the churches that were started from Mars Hill, but they really spend a good majority of their time on personal reflections, people describing what it was like for them personally, or the small group of people they knew after they left Mars Hill. By the way, Belief Ad Network, I guess, love to have you on the show or have you sponsor our show, because this episode of Christianity Today was basically a 2-hour ad for you guys. So that was good marketing on your part. That was smooth, guys. We love it. But I think that there are some things we can learn from it, and maybe some things we should watch out for. I guess I don't think we are gonna, in this episode, we're not gonna pick apart these stories that people tell. I think that potentially, again, I think that I don't think every story is created equal. I think there are times where one side's going to seem clear until you hear from the other. And
that's just a good reminder.
Yep.
That, like, in the end, we have, a lot of compelling evidence, about the various like abuses of power and things like that Driscoll had. We see a lot of issues, and in no way is what I'm saying here defending him.
Right.
But this is an opportunity for literally anybody that wants to come out of the woodwork and say whatever they want about Driscoll. Even this interaction with this guy who goes down there to like meet with him. We don't know what that actually looked like. And we all know what it's like to like have interactions that are kind of confrontational and like spin them in a way that makes us sound really good after the fact. And so like, just remember, the whole of this podcast is certain people giving their side of things and sometimes corroboration, but it's not always there. And maybe it won't always be. And that's like, it's still something that maybe we can learn from, but you just want to be careful as you're making judgments about these things. And
one of the big things you should be able to tell if you listen to this is there are certain narratives about abuse and how we define it and all of those things that are very tied up into the kinds of stories they're telling. And so I think the challenge of listening to this podcast is the challenge we have today, where, for example, domestic violence is real abuse and really happens and is really mishandled often. But there are lots of things that get equated with the term of abuse that aren't like that at all.
Right. Like, I'm unhappy in my marriage. And so therefore it must be some kind of traumatic thing. It must be some kind of abuse. And that allows me to leave it and be justified in what I'm doing.
Right.
That's not always the case. Right.
Right.
That's
right. And so I think, I think as I listen to this, man, to the people that very clearly were hurt and actually harmed, I'm very sorry for you. And I think one of the things that I really learned, as I listened to this, as I thought about this, man, it is actually very hard to help people.
Yeah.
And I had this kind of realization as I think about older pastors that I know, and you can think about this yourself. And maybe Pastor Michael, you can tell me if this is your experience. Older pastors are much less like gung-ho, let's get in there and try and get in and fix this. They're more reserved, and the goals they seem to have when they are trying to help people and counsel them are way more modest. They are very much there. Yeah. I think as a young man, I can be like, man, it kind of feels like you're hedging your bets, or like we're not. But I just wonder if there is a wisdom of just how hard it really is to help people.
Yeah.
An acceptance of limitation.
Think about the ways that people grow and change, how much time that takes. Think about even little things that you've dealt with. Let's just say you're listening to this and you haven't had any like major traumatic events in your life, but you had like, some pretty difficult times with, say, your parents, or maybe with a pastor of the church or something like that. it wasn't abusive. It doesn't rise to that level, but like you had some pretty significant, conflict. And think about how long you've carried that with you. And even when you think about it now, even if you feel like it's more or less resolved, you still feel it deeply, and it still causes you some kinds of disruption in your day-to-day life. Now imagine that times just like an unbelievable number,
Right.
for those who have experienced serious abuse and real trauma. And I think that this wisdom of not feeling like we got to jump in and change everything right now. We got to look for every problem. We got to look under every stone. This, by the way, reminds me of just the approach. Number one, just the mega church evangelical approach in general of, hey, here's this program. It's going to solve all your issues, right? We get you in this program. We get you in this life group. We get you in whatever. And I just think that any of these big box solutions to anything just discount the reality that everybody is so different. And their experience is so different, and the things that they've gone through is so different that like it's so hard on any kind of large level to say, hey, we package this product that will fix your problems, and here we just roll it out for everyone. People don't work that way. People are not that way. And what you really need are shepherds that know all their sheep. The sheep know their shepherd's voice. He knows the ones that are like, they're stubborn as all get out, and I can't pull them or push them. I just got to let them go on their own. And he knows the ones that are like, hey, they'll just follow me no matter what. He knows the ones that you got to bring some oats out just to get them to like follow you around. You got to give some kind of, feedback, some kind of encouragement. He knows the ones that if I put them in this fence, they're going to try to get out. And those that if I put them in this fence, they're never even going to question if they could get out, and I speak as somebody who raises sheep, but this is what sheep are like. And this is what people are like too. And so what a good lesson to learn about not being gung-ho, about just the reality that, you can't approach all problems in the same way. Also the potential damage then when you do this kind of thing that Mars Hill did, where it was like, hey, you get inside of a life group and you got to share every deep, dark thing that's ever happened to you.
I have thoughts
man, we've
on
talked
this.
about this.
Oh man. And they actually use a word, and I don't typically like to adopt the language of sociologists, but right, they call this trauma bonding, right? Where it's like the thing we should all do is we should all just explain all of our deepest, darkest things to each other right away. And then I'm like, what I realized is so much of like, I mean, churches is obviously in this case, but Christian camps, parachurch ministries, all these kinds of things, they use trauma bonding as a ministry model.
They do. It's not just Mars Hill, right?
No,
this is a huge thing throughout evangelicalism.
Yes.
And it's a major problem. it's a major problem. It's just so easily abused, and it so easily destroys people. And you heard that in this episode. I mean, it's really hard to listen to some of this. And again, it treats all of these different situations as if they're the same, and as if the people that go through them are going to be the same and be able to receive help in the same way. Right. And it just completely destroys the possibility of helping many.
Yeah. I mean, again, I just think that, and it obviously makes sense for a person that when you say all the like deepest, darkest things to someone else and they do it back and whatever, like that's going to feel very profound, right? No doubt. Like that's going to feel like, especially if most of your problems are like suburban people, like problems, like, right. So like human problems light, we might call them. Sorry if you're from the suburbs like me and you have real problems, but right, like a lot of these things where they're done in very like young adult ministry type settings, like I don't know how they would handle it if someone with like, well, I'm here to tell you about all the horrible issues of abuse I've struggled with my whole life. Like I don't know, like I think it would be completely destructive in these settings.
One of the things that I noticed listening to this episode again is that it felt like it didn't know how it was going to end. because there was this desire very clearly to say, yeah, what a messy, horrible situation, but look at all the ways that God still worked and used it. But especially because the primary audience that I think Mike Cosper is going for is the deconstructing evangelical, right? Is the disaffected, maybe doesn't even call themselves a Christian anymore. Those are the people he's actually trying to go for.
Yes.
Because of that, because it's a high priority for most of these types of people that they talk a lot about the problems and the pain and the criticisms they have. It seems to me like Mike Cosper wanting to talk about the good things felt like, well, we can't end on what was good, because if we talk about the good things that God did in the midst of the problems, that's like saying that there weren't real problems. It's not as big of a deal. And we discount people's trauma. And so it just felt like they kept going back and forth between, oh man, look at all these good things. Oh, but that doesn't mean it was a good thing, right? Like we don't think it was good. It was good. It was still bad. Like, for those of you who are angry, oh man, we get you. And here's some good things, but that doesn't mean, it just felt really like they didn't know where to end it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think in our next episode, I think that what you're saying is basically going to agree with the thesis I have staked out. I think there's obviously plenty of things we could talk about, but there's maybe two things that this reminds me of that makes me want to leave it. I'll just say that, again, a lot of the questions that get asked in this section of the episode, which I think we're going to kind of leave behind, is where's the fault? What do we blame for this kind of abuse? So we're going to bring up things like complementarianism, and we're going to bring up these things. We're going to bring up the leadership structure again. And again, not opposed to bringing up possible answers to this question. But I will just say that listening to this episode, the two most abusive counseling situations both involved an intense version of a kind of charismatic theology, where a woman was being told that she needed to wait on a word from the Lord until she was told to stay with her husband, who apparently self-confessed to domestic violence. And then where they attempted to do a demon trial, a thing they talked about earlier in the series, with a man with mental illness, right? And so I know we've pointed this out a number of times. It's crazy to me that the theology that makes that kind of pastoral ministry make sense gets a pass. I'm not saying, because there are plenty of charismatic people and obviously lots of continuationist people who don't practice anything like that.
Yep.
But it is aggravating to such a high degree, perhaps because I'm a person who holds the theology that they actually do blame for these things, that there's an entire active section or even the like mega church Pentecostal guys who never get held accountable, right? That there is an entire structure of theology that exists to hold up these kinds of things that we don't have to blame. We don't need 25 minutes on this in the last episode for whatever reason.
Yeah, it is striking. Maybe especially as we come to a close with this podcast, where the blame is laid outside of Driscoll himself, right? Everybody agrees, right. Dude, that guy's to blame for a lot of this stuff, right? But besides that, when we talk about the church structures, the theological backing, that it's kind of held up as, well, this is one of those things that we should probably be looking at as a reason for all that went down. I think it's important actually to notice, okay, what isn't mentioned, right? For instance, there was a whole bonus episode that they do on this podcast about the Christianity Today and how it evidently was like, the organization itself was prone to certain kinds of abuse or something like that, or, sexual misconduct. And so they were reported on themselves on this podcast because that's one of the things that this has been about. But whenever we're talking about like mega church evangelicalism, I don't see how Christianity Today gets a pass on that. You don't think they've propped up every single one of these people? Because
With
they
cover
have.
stories.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the whole business model, has been playing off of these well-known big name people, and talking about their books and their conferences and everything like that. So even that, just remember where this is coming from.
Yeah. And so I think perhaps maybe the last thing we should talk about and this is starting to run into what we're going to do in the next episode, but having this discussion of abuse, I think we want to leave it here. It is interesting that part of the blame for how these kinds of abusive situations were entered into was due to the hubris of these pastors who thought they could handle these situations when they couldn't. Now, I want Pastor Michael to leave us with what the church is competent for, because there is a part of this that might be true, but there's a part of this that left me concerned. For example, right, the fact that when a man is a self-admitted abuse of his spouse, I think repentance as a pastor for him would be saying, turn yourself into the police and see what they do.
Yeah.
Right. Because there are things that the pastor has not been given to, that other authorities in the world have been given to, calling the police in those cases is 100% the right thing to do and necessary. But what becomes concerning then is, well, don't you just need to hire professional counselors? Like, they start going through all the the Western culture today we have a increasing cult of experts on everything. And so what I'm concerned is, if we want to, let me give one small case before I've just passed this over to Pastor Michael, is in the case of this abuse, right? Obviously calling the police, they are needing to sort out the actual physical safety harm, like, if there is actually crime, like if there is an actual crime, like that's their job to figure out, not mine. Mm-hmm. However, if this couple is going to ever reconcile, which may not happen, but certainly happens in some cases, it would seem to me the pastor on what that would mean biblically is the precise person, right? Mm-hmm. That is something that they would have something to say about. Not everything, perhaps. There might be other things there might be other people brought in. I don't know. But so I get this, like, I don't know. I don't want to give up the role of the pastor in a person's life. Yeah. And I don't want pastors to be afraid of taking the role of a pastor in my or anyone else's life. I obviously agree with perhaps some of the specific situations that they say were mishandled, which they do mention. Well, then the church created a policy document of what you have to do, right? And I'm sure it was things like it's wild. I mean, it's a wild mega church problem that they're having to create policy statements on what to do when people report abuse. There's a scale here I can't imagine. But it just leaves me wondering and thinking about what the church is competent to do in their mind and in reality.
Yeah, I don't know how much more I would add, just because it's so messy. And there are clear lines in regards to things like, there's a crime. If there's a crime involved, call the police. That's it. I mean, there's no, like, it's not and again, doesn't mean that you're not going to still be involved. Right. Then you're maybe visiting this guy in jail and talking to him about what repentance looks like. And you're talking to the spouse about, hey, what does this mean for you? What does it mean for the marriage? What, biblically speaking, like, how do you heal? How do you learn how to, both, trust God and trust others, and to forgive in a situation that is absolutely horrific. There are so many different, like, elements that I think it's good and right and necessary for the pastor to be involved in. And there's obvious elements that I think the pastor doesn't, it's not the role of a pastor to be involved in. The messy part to me is in basically the overwhelming amount of mess, for lack of a better word. Just the overwhelming amount of, hey, we're several generations into broken families. It's not like, hey, I grew up in a somewhat stable environment and now something really hard happened. It's, hey, this is generations of abuse and trauma and things like that. And that to me is just, it's harder in the sense that there are going to be actual like physical, mental issues that arise from that it's very likely that you might not be super competent in handling.
Right.
However, even when you're not competent in like handling every detail of it, I think to then be like, hey, yeah, pastors, like this is the role for like a therapist or something, is to discount what God has given, in that like what you do have is you have the scripture and you can speak the word of God into these situations in a way that no one else has been commissioned to do. Yeah. And if there's going to be true, lasting, everlasting healing of anybody, it's only going to come through the healing hand of God, who speaks through his word and works through his appointed means in the church. And so while it's messy and difficult, I am very concerned about those that would try to relegate the role of the pastor to something like, hey, you do a couple things on Sunday mornings and that's about it. Because I think that people need the word of God spoken into their life.
Part 1 of After the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill is now in the books. Please, if you haven't, we don't ever really say this kind of thing. Please go and subscribe. Click subscribe on our podcast feed in your podcast catcher if you're listening to this from somewhere.
Yep. If you could also just go ahead and leave a review if you've been listening. Leave a review for us. We know there's so many of you that have not reviewed the show, and we're not great at reminding you. I know as an avid podcast listener, I very regularly hear, hey, go subscribe, and I just, never do it. Or, hey, go review, and I just never do it. But every once in a while, I get the reminder and I think, oh yeah, that'd be easy to do right now. And so I do it. So hopefully if you're hearing this, that's you. You've never done it. You've heard us say it. Go ahead and do that. And if you let us know that you've done that, we will send you a sticker. We'll send you a Restless sticker. We've got a bunch of them. We'll send it to anybody that wants to review the podcast, as long as you contact us and let us know that you did it.
Boom. That's a good deal.